Hello and welcome to Rockanory, the Jackanory for music literature lovers everywhere. I'm Zoe Howe and thank you very much for joining me today. And this is the first reading that I'm doing on this channel, so it's very exciting for me anyway. I've decided to read a piece from the fantastic Nick Kent's book, The Dark Stuff, which is a collection of his music journalism and memories and just fantastic musings. It came out a few years ago on Faber, and he's even written in it as well. And he's even got the 2 dots on my E as well, which is always a good sign if someone knows their umlauts, which I judge a man by his umlaut usage. And I've decided to read a piece that he's written, or a bit of a piece that he's written about Iggy Pop. Not least because I'm going to see Iggy and Stooges tomorrow night at Hammersmith Apollo, where they'll be playing Raw Power, so I'm very excited about that. So this is from The 4 Ages of a Man Named Pop, Pictures of Iggy. The first time I ever met Iggy Pop, it was in early February 1972. The 60s were not long over, and he was celebrating the fact by sporting a pair of $400 silver leather pants and a tacky pregnant woman's smock with a big ugly flower embroidered on the front. He had long flaxen hair past his shoulder and big penetrating Bambi eyes staring out like approaching headlights on a long black highway. When he finally spoke, this deep, rather suave sounding He-Man voice emerged, edged with a manic chuckle that would send it momentarily spiralling up into an altogether higher octave range. Though he carried himself in a robust sort of way, he was pretty frail and feminine looking, and at 5'7" he wasn't exactly tall either. But then, to me, it seemed like he was towering above the rest of the world. Which was true, at least in the sense that here he was, still a young man in his early 20s, and already he'd changed the whole shape and artistic vision of rock and roll music, not once but twice. There was one slight problem, however. Hardly anyone had noticed his accomplishments. In fact, it wasn't so much they hadn't noticed, more that they'd been actively repelled by the music they'd heard, coming from the Stooges. Iggy's chaotic, antisocial rock band from the suburbs of the Motor City, there in that stretch of America known as the Midwest. In the late 60s, the attitude among most working rock bands became increasingly fixated around long improvisational jamming segments with appropriate displays of technical expertise. But the Stooges weren't interested in straining and soaring against the entire dark ages of music, as some insufferable bore once described just such an example of that approach, the power trio Cream on British television. On the contrary, they were hell-bent on taking a time capsule right back to the darkest ages of music they could hope to sink into, back to that dim time when the world was one big pulsating swamp which shook with the terrible thunderous rhythms of nature's raw elemental power. To this end, they beat out this muddy, brutal, ecstatic music that grabbed anyone in its path roughly by the scruff of the neck and hurled them headlong into the very wilderness of the senses that lies stretched out just beyond man's deepest primordial fears. For some, like myself, being exposed to music this raw and alive had a profoundly liberating effect. But most people in the late 60s and early 70s who came into direct contact with it found the experience unsettling and often bordering on the frankly repugnant. Not that the Stooges themselves ever gave a tinker's cuss what anyone else might have thought about them and their music. They had this gang mentality that was the usual 4 losers against the world riff, except they took that riff and blasted it through the loudest PA system they could construct, until all the nervy punk bravado wriggling around in their gut was pushed right up in the audience's collective face, and you either became duly smitten by what you experienced, or else you pretty much wilted under the sheer horrendousness of it all. Being a proper gang, of course, involved the added responsibility of creating your own cool language. Bogue was one such word, short for bogus, that the Stooges had invented to describe, well, everyone else in the world apart from themselves, quite frankly. Another key phrase for them was the O-mind, or just O-mind. It referred to those times when the individuals in the group spread out around the communal bong and got even more righteously stoned than was normally the case. At this stage, all conversation would cease, eyes would fall shut, heads would tilt back, and minds would feel like they were opening up, like there was a big O shape where their brains had formerly been, this hole looking down through to the subconscious and then back through to the dawn of time itself, back to when dinosaurs still roamed the land, when strange birds of prey hung in the skies, and where large prehistoric amplifiers vibrated with the horrendous howling of strange tribal madness. This was the Stooges' fundamental vision anyway, and the reason why they created this monstrous tribal music, with Iggy's free expression vocal gymnastics giving it a most singular context and charisma. They were so raw to begin with, the ability to actually write a song with a riff, verses and a chorus only came to them a couple of nights before they went into the studio with John Cale to record their first album for Elektra Records. The eponymously titled result got immediately slammed by a Rolling Stone critic for being a one-group definition of musical juvenile delinquency, and it sold abysmally. But 7 years after its release in the summer of 1969, a whole new lost generation looted the sound, content and attitude of those pithy, pissed-off songs wholesale to help create some splenetic musical outbursts of their own over in England that got tagged together as something called punk rock. Then came Funhouse a year later, which found the Stooges working on a darker musical terrain altogether, mixing pioneering metal riffs and freeform jazz saxophone honks with tribal grooves and a lot of hard funk as well. Iggy was in his element with his kind of heathen backdrop because he could stretch out and do his James Brown-inspired King of the Jungle routine with all the ear-shredding screams and deep animal grunts. It was real Heart of Darkness music in the classic Kurtzian sense, and a lot further down the river of no return, sonically speaking, than their debut. One of the key reasons for this downward shift was the fact that the Stooges would later... skipped a page. The Stooges themselves had shifted away from the old regime of pot and psychedelics towards harder, more deadly chemicals. It's useful to recognise that when the Stooges started performing, Iggy always felt compelled to drop 2 acid tabs before each gig, about 10 minutes before he'd actually hit the stage. The tabs would quickly start kicking in and he'd feel the first lysergic flashes as soon as he saw the audience's hungry eyes. For the next 40 minutes, he'd feel the music his band was playing surge through him with such absolute intensity it would involuntarily throw him into the extraordinary contortions and acts of wanton self-destructiveness that would most inform his future legend. That's also why Stooges gigs were so notoriously short. After 40 minutes he'd start hallucinating so intensely he'd usually become completely incapacitated. But then everything in this daring young man's eggshell psyche started getting a little overheated because of all the sensory upheaval going on, until one night in early 1970 when a Stooges roadie introduced him to heroin. The effect was so calming, like suddenly finding yourself lying under the stars in a perfect little island all of your own creation, where gentle sea breezes caress the skin and a sweet seductive music comes in strange beguiling tonalities with the voice of a woman singing wordlessly against its rhythm. Anyway, in no time at all, the guy was a full-tilt junkie, as were most of the rest of the band. This in turn prompted a number of very ugly episodes, and after most of the Stooges' equipment got pawned for junk, and Iggy had overdosed several times, the group dissolved, leaving most of its individual members no other option than to sign on at a local methadone clinic in Michigan. When I first met Iggy, he'd been straight for some months, as had his partner, James Williamson, a young guitarist with cold, angry eyes and a severely acne-ravaged complexion, who'd been in one of the Stooges' final lineups. After cleaning up in Ann Arbor, Iggy had travelled to New York late in 1971 to consider his next move, when he met the London-born singer-songwriter David Bowie, who alerted his new manager, Tony DeFries, to sign up the performer. DeFries had duly secured him a deal with Columbia Records and had flown him to London with Williamson alongside, supposedly in order to monitor his career at closer range. So there they were, these 2 black-hearted, ominous-looking individuals from the Motor City, living together in a little house in tame, salubrious Maida Vale, looking for some like-minded limeys to fill in on bass and drums so they could record the Stooges' 3rd musical chapter. I remember asking them how they envisaged this 3rd musical statement might end up sounding. Iggy pondered the question for a moment while dangling a wine glass he was sipping from rather daintily from his left hand. Then he drove the glass down hard onto a little table directly in front of him, noisily shattering its base. "Something like that," he replied evenly. I'm going to leave it there, but as I say, The Dark Stuff by Nick Kent I thoroughly recommend if you haven't got it already, and I hope you enjoyed that first reading on Rockanory. Join me again sometime, and next week there'll be another 10 minutes of rock literature fabulousness. See you soon.